The security guard's hand came up like a wall, stopping him just inches from the golden doors, as if his very presence didn't belong in a place that glittered so brightly. Conversations dimmed. Heads turned. And in that moment, under the harsh afternoon sunlight reflecting off polished glass, Kael Verin felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life, smaller than the struggles he had endured, smaller than the sacrifices he carried silently every single day. Before we step further into this story, take a moment. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the idea that people are more than what they appear, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Echoes the Stories. Your support helps stories like this reach hearts that need them most. Kael hadn't always been invisible. There was a time when his name meant something, when his voice carried weight in rooms filled with people who made decisions that shaped lives. But that life had been swallowed whole by a series of choices, losses, and a single devastating night that rewrote everything he thought he knew about himself. Now, he was just a man in a slightly wrinkled shirt, holding an envelope too carefully, as if it contained the last fragile piece of hope he had left. The gala was already in full motion behind the glass doors. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above elegantly dressed guests, laughter spilled into the afternoon air, and expensive cars lined the curb like silent declarations of power and prestige. It was a world Kael used to navigate effortlessly. But today, standing on the outside, he felt like a stranger peering into someone else's dream. In his other hand, tightly clasped, was a small, worn photograph, one he had almost left behind but couldn't. It showed a little girl with bright, uncontainable joy in her eyes, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck. Elira. His daughter. The reason he was here. The reason he had walked through humiliation, through doubt, through the long shadows of his past just to reach this moment. The guard's voice was firm but not cruel, repeating the same line that had already cut deeper than intended. Kael didn't argue. He had learned long ago that sometimes, dignity meant knowing when not to raise your voice. Still, something in his chest tightened, a quiet storm threatening to break. He looked down at the envelope again, the invitation that bore his name, proof that he belonged here, even if the world refused to see it. Behind the guard, a few guests exchanged glances. Some curious. Some dismissive. One woman in a deep navy gown watched longer than the others, her expression unreadable, as if she sensed that there was more to this man than the surface suggested. But the moment passed, and the rhythm of the gala swallowed the brief disruption. Kael took a step back, the weight of rejection settling over him like a familiar coat. It wasn't the first time life had told him he didn't belong. After Elira's mother passed, the world had shifted in ways he hadn't been prepared for. The late nights at the hospital, the quiet apartment filled with echoes, the endless balancing act of being both father and mother, it had reshaped him. He had traded tailored suits for practical clothes, boardroom meetings for school drop-offs, ambition for survival. There were nights he didn't sleep, mornings he barely made it through, and days when the simplest tasks felt impossible. But Elira had always been his anchor, her laughter cutting through the darkness, reminding him that even in loss, there was still something worth holding on to. The invitation had arrived unexpectedly, tucked between bills and advertisements, its elegant design standing out against the ordinary. At first, Kael thought it was a mistake. But his name was there, unmistakable, printed with intention. It was from Orion Enterprises, the very company he had once helped build from the ground up before walking away when life demanded more from him than he could give. He hadn't planned on coming. The thought of stepping back into that world felt like reopening a wound that had barely healed. But Elira had insisted in her own quiet way, placing the invitation back into his hands and smiling with a faith that only children possess. She had said nothing, but her eyes told him everything, that she believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. And so he came. But now, standing outside those doors, being told he didn't belong, that fragile thread of belief began to unravel. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavier than the last. Kael turned, ready to leave, ready to accept that maybe this had been a mistake after all. But then something shifted. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle at first, then undeniable. Conversations paused. Heads turned again, but this time not with curiosity, with recognition. A man emerged from inside the gala, his presence commanding without effort. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the entrance until they landed on Kael. And in that instant, everything changed. The guard straightened, uncertainty flickering across his face. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Kael didn't recognize the man immediately. Years had a way of altering appearances, of softening edges and adding layers. But there was something familiar in the way he carried himself, something that tugged at a memory Kael hadn't visited in a long time. The man approached, his gaze unwavering, and then, something unexpected happened. The distance between them closed, and instead of dismissal, there was respect. Deep, unmistakable respect. Kael felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically, but in the way reality suddenly rearranged itself. The narrative he had accepted, that he was no longer part of this world, that he had been forgotten, began to crack. Because the truth was something entirely different. Years ago, when Orion Enterprises was nothing more than an idea scribbled on paper, it was Kael who had taken the first risk. It was his vision that had shaped its foundation, his sleepless nights that had brought it to life. But when tragedy struck, he had stepped away without looking back, leaving his share, his recognition, his legacy behind in exchange for time, the one thing money could never buy. What he didn't know was that his absence hadn't erased him. Inside those walls, his story had lived on. His name had become something almost mythic, spoken with quiet reverence by those who knew the truth. And the man now standing before him had been there from the beginning, a witness to everything Kael had built and everything he had sacrificed. The realization hit like a wave, powerful and disorienting. The guard stepped aside. The doors opened. And for the first time that day, Kael felt seen. But what made the moment truly overwhelming wasn't the recognition, or the sudden shift in how others looked at him. It was the understanding that all the years he had spent believing he had lost everything, he hadn't lost himself. He stepped forward, each step carrying the weight of his journey, of every hardship, every quiet victory, every moment he chose to keep going even when it felt impossible. Inside, the gala seemed different now. The same lights, the same laughter, the same elegance, but none of it felt out of reach anymore. It felt like a chapter he had once closed, now reopening with new meaning. And somewhere, far from the noise and the spectacle, there was a little girl waiting at home, unaware that her belief had just changed everything. As the evening unfolded, stories resurfaced, truths were shared, and the man who had once been turned away became the center of a narrative no one could ignore. Not because of power, or wealth, or status, but because of something far more enduring. Resilience. Love. And the quiet strength of a father who never gave up. If this story has touched your heart in any way, take a moment to engage with the video. Your like, your comment, your share might help someone else believe that their story isn't over yet. And before we close, here's something special. Comment below with one word that represents hope to you. Because sometimes, all it takes is a single moment, a single act of recognition, to remind us that we are more than our struggles, and that even when the world says we don't belong, the truth has a way of finding us.